Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I want to talk about PhD portfolio management. Sounds a little scary. And how you can actually use some strategies or think about some strategies for your PhD research pipeline. So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school that I decided to pay the favor forward and help you out as much as I possibly can. All right, so in terms of the PhD portfolio management and thinking about your research pipeline, it's a really important thing to think about in terms of where you're going to take your research direction and what sort of projects that you're currently working on. So what I think of in terms of my PhD portfolio is the projects that I'm currently working on are the ones that are currently active or in my mind, I guess. And you can create a list, you can write it down, you can have a little agenda or have something on a bulletin board or something like that. And if anybody uses bulletin boards anymore. But the other thing to think about is also your pipeline. This is the evolving nature of things that happens with the projects that you're currently working on, right? So you might have, at the beginning of a PhD program, you might only have a couple of projects that you're working on, papers that you're working on, and then as you sort of grow and develop as a scholar, you might get more and more of those particular projects. And it evolves as you're moving along. It definitely does evolve and change as you're moving as a scholar and going through this sort of PhD journey that we all go through. And I consider myself still on that. I think most people, that even people that are in their 80s would probably consider that as well, as on a PhD journey or sort of it and looking at the world around them. So here are some couple of strategies that lots of people sort of think about in terms of dealing with their portfolio. Now, mind you, this is probably going to be more related to people that are doing sort of strategy or business or something in a business administration kind of degree, because it's just the nature of the work we do. But I think it also applies in terms of running a lab or thinking about a lab as well, because there's definitely a lot to be learned from that. It's definitely a lot more complicated in terms of when you're running one of these massive labs that we think about, and maybe it's a chemistry lab, for example. But I think that the different strategies actually hold, and some of them are borrowed from what are called generic business strategies from Michael Porter, who talked about sort of how businesses operate, right? So the first one is thinking about being a low-cost leader. And this is a strategy where you might publish a lot of different publications that you can possibly do. And you do this sort of, regardless of quality to some extent. So you want to be as good as what the next best person is doing in sort of your reference set. So you want to be doing just good enough that people are sort of pleasantly pleased with what you're doing. And in that kind of strategy, what you're doing is a lot more of a numbers game, where you're counting the number of articles that you have. And we all do that. That's totally fine. But that's kind of a strategy that a lot of people might choose. And the more articles that you have, the sort of better the predictor of your performance might be based on what you're doing with that strategy. A second one is a product differentiation strategy. And you'll notice that some people just don't have a lot of publications on their resume, but some of the ones that they do have are spectacular, or they just do really cool, interesting things. Well, what they're doing is a product differentiation strategy. So what they're doing, and none of these are better than the other, but you sort of pick and choose based on your personality or what happens in your environment, right? That's really what and you could do equally well at any of these different strategies, just like in business, right? So Walmart is a spectacularly amazing company, and they do kind of a low-cost leader sort of strategy. And then, Ferrari, for example, is a spectacularly amazing company, and they do product differentiation sort of strategy. And they're equally successful, and nobody's right or wrong. This is the one thing I wanted to clearly point out with this. So the one is the product differentiation. What you're doing is you're focusing on a small number of products, a small number of papers, and doing a really good job at each one of those papers, or to the best of your possible ability, and spending a fair bit of time working on each individual paper and really going into a deep dive in each one of those papers. And that's a really good strategy to do. The third strategy that's three. The third strategy that people do is kind of like a real options or stage gate approach. And this is what you would learn in sort of innovation management or R&D management, product development. Really what you're doing, and they're very, very similar in the styles that you're doing. One of them, real options, is about placing small bets on different projects that you think can turn into something that's amazing. So this might be working with a certain data set that you really think is interesting, and just kind of seeing what happens. So maybe you write a little article and see if people are excited about that data. Maybe it is working with, a certain PhD student or working with a certain co-author, for example, and you're just seeing how it pans out and that actually if this is a good working relationship. So you do little projects to see whether it actually turns out into something that's a little bit more serious. Now, there's a related approach, and this is a stage gate approach, where you actually have defined moments where you have many different ideas that you can work on. And then you sort of refine them at each sort of stage. I should go that way. At each sort of stage of the process. So you might think, oh, I've got all these different projects I'm going to work on, but only going to pick a few that I really like and work on those. And then you pick a few more and only work on those until you actually end up have a end product that is really good, and you've got multiple products on the go, multiple papers on the go. The other one is another approach is kind of like a selection process where you work on many different projects, and it's not necessarily you're not necessarily doing things in any sort of strategic way. And over time, it just happens that certain projects sort of outperform other ones. So, for example, you might have 10 different projects on the go. In one of them, for whatever reason, it appeals to the audience or appeals to the people that are paying attention. Right? So different candidates out there are really paying attention to a certain paper. So you give that a little bit more resources. Or, for example, you might have 10 different papers on the go, and then one of them gets into a conference. Then you're really excited about that, and you start working on that particular paper because it got into the conference. But the 9 other ones don't get in, and so it's kind of like a natural process of evolution that happens. And what you're trying to do is sort of just looking at how things evolve. And sometimes that really does happen, that there is this natural evolution. Maybe you're working with a certain person and the relationship kind of stops, for example, or that life is happening. And, there's lots of things that could happen along the way where it's kind of like an evolutionary approach. And that is a really fine approach as well. And I think it definitely aids in how we might think about the product development process with PhDs. And then the last one is kind of a learning approach. And I'm probably a little bit more I lean towards that just because that's my natural bent in terms of what I've learned over the years, no pun intended. And so I study organizational learning. And really that just means how you improve, or how a company or organization, maybe it's a group, improves with experience that they gather. And so what you're looking at is, with this approach, is you're looking to see at how the different skills, or what skills you can acquire along the way with the different projects that you're working on, and use those skills and leverage those skills into other projects that you're working on. So you might be really good at understanding, maybe it's alliances, for example, and then you use this understanding of alliances to go and look at research and development in general, and you work with somebody that has research and development understanding, and then you sort of merge these together, and you have a project that's on strategic alliances within research and development. And that's a very good way to sort of think about how you're leveraging things. And it's kind of this learning approach where you're constantly acquiring knowledge and acquiring new skills along the way so you can get better and better as a scholar. Now, I want to point out again that all of these different strategies blend together, and that sometimes in some moments you're going to be doing one or the other depending on what's happening. But what I think is probably the best strategy to choose, and there's really not a lot of strategic action that happens, right? So you have to assume that we all have a lot of agency with a lot of these processes, but often we don't, and we just kind of happenstance sort of fall into different things. It's kind of more the evolutionary sort of selection approach perspective. But often what you should be thinking about is, filling in the gaps with the different papers or projects that you're working on that is close to your identity, and as well as the ones that are closest to completion, or ones that they're far along, but they resonate, not only that they're far along, but they resonate with what you're about and what you're excited about at the current moment, and continuously going forward and asking yourself, what is the best approach that resonates with your identity, and the papers that resonate with your identity. Now, you have to be careful with that because you don't want to be constantly switching to something else. And that's why I would recommend always working on something that's near to completion, so you can push things along. But you're looking at this as kind of an evolutionary approach where you are learning about different things and acquiring this knowledge. So it's a learning approach. But then as well, you're evolving as a human being, evolving as a scholar, and your knowledge is evolving and your insights are evolving. So you can constantly be acquiring new knowledge to work on this identity going forward. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the strategy that I personally would choose. And so it's a blend of all of those together, and depending on the sort of moment and the different tasks that you're working on, you might sort of pick and choose the other, and all of them combined, so that you can create something that works with your own identity going forward and who you are as an individual or a scholar going forward. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate it. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Bye.